My water broke in the middle of a violent storm at night, making my legs tremble uncontrollably. One hand held my painful belly, the other typed on the keyboard to call my husband, but the only thing I heard was the moaning of his mistress, his close friend. In silence, I recorded everything and sent it to their superior, my father-in-law. 30 minutes later, my husband arrived at the emergency department with disheveled clothes and a pale face. My name is Camilla Caldwell, 34 years old, head of department at a major tech company in Detroit. At 3 a.m., as a violent storm lashed sheets of rain against the windows of our 3-bedroom house near the river, I suddenly felt a tight contraction in my abdomen, followed by the gush of my water breaking across the cold hardwood floor. I was dazed, gripping the edge of the cabinet to keep myself steady, my breath cut short by relentless waves of contractions tearing through my body. Trembling, I fumbled with my phone, calling my husband, renowned OB-GYN Samuel Anderson, whom I believed would rush to my side in this moment of crisis. But what I heard wasn't his worried voice. It was a woman's gasp, moaning, and then Samuel's soft chuckle. "Baby, easy now. Camilla, I'm in the middle of an emergency case. Why are you calling this early?" I went numb, lips drying in shock, yet my mind was disturbingly clear. I hit record and held the phone to my ear to capture every sound of betrayal, echoing loud and clear through the speaker. When another contraction clenched my abdomen, I didn't cry, didn't scream. I simply opened my messages and sent the recording to my father-in-law, Christopher Anderson, founder of Cassian Medical Center, with a single message. "Dad, my water just broke. Samuel's busy." 7 minutes later, the wail of an ambulance pierced through the stormy night. Christopher had called them himself. EMTs set up an IV line right at my doorstep as my blood pressure dropped sharply. They murmured to each other that I was hemorrhaging. I tried calling Samuel again, not because I needed him, but because I wanted to document more of the truth. And once more, I heard that woman's voice. Jessica Vance, my husband's close friend, head nurse of the OB-GYN ward at Cassian, gasping and calling out his name. A sharp pain tore down my hip, and I clenched my teeth, but all I could think was, James will not be born into this lie. As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the vehicle sped through the night toward Cassian, I watched the flickering lights reflect on the ceiling above and felt fear drain from me. I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The child inside me deserved the truth, and this storm was no longer just outside. It had begun inside my life. And as the ambulance raced through the night toward Cassian, where the real storm was just about to begin, I hadn't even caught my breath when the ER doors burst open, harsh white lights glaring across my pale face. A young male intern ran up to push the gurney, his voice trembling slightly, but trying to stay calm. While checking my pulse and the baby's heart rate, he said one sentence, almost absent-mindedly, that froze me to the core. "Dr. Samuel ended his shift this afternoon. I even saw Nurse Jessica in a red dress riding shotgun in his car when they left the lot at 5. That sentence fell into my ears like a clean cut of a blade, slicing through every sweet explanation Samuel had fed me over the past 3 months. The so-called night shifts, emergency patients, the chief needs my help, were nothing but a paper-thin veil over a blatant betrayal. In an instant, the exhaustion, the mornings I woke up alone, the missed calls, and the nights Samuel stayed out until 6 a.m., they all assembled into a horrific picture I was being forced to look at. But I had no time to grieve, because at that very moment the monitor shrieked, the line tracking James's heartbeat plummeting so fast the nurse screamed for backup. I heard the rush of footsteps, urgent commands. "Code red, prep the OR." Then, I was being pushed rapidly through the corridor, ceiling lights blurring into streaks of white above me. And in that chaos, I saw a familiar figure approaching. Christopher, my father-in-law, in a black suit, his face frozen with deep, seething fury. He placed his hand on my shoulder, his voice low and steel-strong. "I'm here now." Just 4 words, but they let me know I was no longer alone in this battle. Before the 4 words, "I'm here now," even had time to settle, the sound of hurried footsteps rose from the end of the hallway, the rustle of a disheveled lab coat scraping against the wall. And then Samuel appeared in a state he probably never imagined he would be caught in. His lab coat wrinkled, the edge of it smeared with a faint layer of makeup, and right on his neck, under the stark white hospital lights, was a blurred red lipstick mark that he hadn't had time to wipe off. A strange perfume trailed faintly behind him with each step he took, completely at odds with the thick smell of disinfectant in the ER. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but Christopher, the man who had kept this entire hospital standing for 3 decades, did not give Samuel even a single breath of opportunity. A sharp, ice-cold crack rang out across the tiled hallway, so loud that several nurses in the on-call room jolted and turned around. Christopher struck his son across the face, without hesitation, without restraint, without bothering to hide the contempt blazing in his eyes. Samuel staggered, clutching his cheek, looking up at his father in sheer horror, as if realizing for the first time that this had gone far beyond the realm of a personal mistake. Christopher didn't say another word. He simply pulled out his phone, opened the exact audio file I had sent at 3 a.m., and played it on maximum volume. The moans, the whispers from Jessica, Samuel's breathless laugh of pleasure, all of it echoed through the hospital hallway like a living indictment. No one dared breathe too loudly. Some froze, some clutched their chests, and a few suddenly understood why Christopher had frantically called 911 at dawn. When the recording ended, the silence was so heavy I could hear the ventilator in the room next door. Samuel finally collapsed, his knees hitting the cold tile, his trembling hands pressed against the floor, as though his body no longer had the strength to stand. He gasped, his shoulders shaking, but he didn't dare cry, didn't dare lift his face. And in that moment, I realized Samuel's collapse didn't come from his father's slap, but from the fact that the truth had been exposed in the one place he always considered his domain. He hadn't only betrayed me, he had also betrayed his own reputation, and the last shred of dignity he believed he still possessed. But none of that mattered anymore when the operating room doors swung open and a doctor's voice tore through the air. "Get the patient in now. Fetal heart rate dropping." I only caught the terrified expression of a young nurse before my body was pushed into a corridor of harsh white light. The smell of antiseptic burning up my consciousness. Everything happened too fast, ceiling lights streaking past in long blurs. I heard the monitor's alarms screaming, doctors urging one another, "Hurry, we're losing the heartbeat." In that moment, when the line between life and death thinned to something terrifyingly fragile, I could only think of my child, James, and hope he would have a chance to enter this world. Then, a small, weak but clear cry broke through the crowded operating room. A doctor whispered, almost breathless, 2.4 kilograms, put him on ventilatory support immediately. I couldn't see my baby's face, only the tiny silhouette of James being rushed into an incubator, tubes and sensors covering his fragile body. It was the most beautiful moment of my life, but also the moment I felt myself slipping away from my own body. Another voice struck near my ear, heavy as a hammer. "Patient has lost nearly 3 liters of blood. Prepare another unit." I heard it as if from somewhere far away. All the sounds stretched, distorted, and my heartbeat slowed. A hand gripped mine tightly. Someone whispered, "If we had been just a few minutes later, we would have lost both." When I woke up in the recovery room, the lights were softer, but my body felt as though it had been dragged through a storm of fire. The first thing I heard was not congratulations on becoming a mother, but Christopher's heavy footsteps and his voice low and tightly restrained. "Samuel is not allowed in here, not one step." And that was exactly what happened. Samuel stood outside the recovery room, separated by a glass panel, his hands gripping the edge of the wall, his face pale and utterly powerless. For the first time since our wedding, He was stripped of the right to call himself a husband, and entirely forbidden from touching the tiny life I had nearly died to bring into the world. As the anesthesia thinned, my eyelids felt forged from iron, but I forced them open, and the moment my vision cleared, I saw Samuel standing behind the glass, both hands gripping the frame, as if clinging to the last scrap of dignity he had left. His eyes were bloodshot, but I felt nothing for that gaze anymore. I simply turned my head, my voice hoarse but cold, as if the entire storm from the night before had condensed into a single blade. "Go take a shower. Her perfume is too strong. My child can't stand it." Samuel recoiled, as if the words had struck straight into his chest. But before he could speak, Christopher stepped forward, his eyes no longer filled with disappointment, only a fury that had matured into something close to despair. He issued the order in front of every medical staff member present. "Effective immediately, Samuel is placed under house restriction. Confiscate all keys, office, and the secret apartment." The nurses and hospital security exchanged glances, but no one dared object. Samuel was helpless, escorted out of the recovery wing like someone who no longer had a place in the very hospital he once walked through with pride for years. I thought I would get at least one quiet afternoon to breathe, but not long after, the door to my room opened. A delivery worker set down a small gift box tied with a bright red ribbon. The shade so vivid it reflected the overhead lights. I didn't need to read the name to know who had sent it. I opened the card and read the crooked handwritten line, "Get well soon so you can go home to your baby. Jessica." Inside the box were 3 packets of handcrafted red raspberry leaf tea, the exact type Jessica had praised to me dozens of times, as a secret to an easier labor. The herbal scent rose sweetly, but cold enough to raise every hair on my skin. A young nurse beside the bed stared at the box for a moment, then frowned slightly and whispered, just for me to hear, "Camilla, this box doesn't have an FDA label." The words swept through the room like an icy draft, and every suspicion I had buried at the bottom of my heart surged up, sharp, terrifying, and impossible to ignore. I clenched the blanket, feeling that something far worse than betrayal was waiting to be uncovered. And as the words "no FDA label" continued to echo in my mind, a chilling sensation crawled down my spine, like someone had just flung open a door leading to a truth darker than anything I had ever suspected about betrayal. I breathed slowly, staring at the box of tea in front of me, and suddenly, memories from the last 3 months of my pregnancy came flooding back, so vivid I could almost smell the herbs Samuel brewed every night. He would step into the kitchen, take out the silver kettle Jessica had given him, scoop spoonfuls of dark brown tea, and stir it slowly into a cup as if performing a ritual. He spoke to me with the tone of a responsible husband. "Jessica says this helps soften the cervix, so labor will be easier." Every day, without fail, Samuel prepared that tea, and I, in the blind trust of a wife, never questioned his insistence on being the one to make it. But now, looking back, I realized the signs had been there all along. The sudden leg cramps that twisted my muscles at night, the spasms so intense I sometimes collapsed onto the cold bathroom floor. The times my heart raced abnormally, a breathless anxiety like something was tightening around my chest. I had even gone in for a checkup outside my regular appointments, but the doctor said everything was within normal range. I believed it. I let it all pass as mere pregnancy fatigue. And worse, whenever I winced in pain or told Samuel I felt off, Jessica would always appear at just the right moment, wearing that unreadable smile and placing a light hand on my shoulder. "Keep drinking it. It'll help with the birth. Trust me." Those words now echoed in my mind like a poisoned lullaby. A nurse once joked, "You drink that tea more religiously than water," and I had laughed, not knowing what I was swallowing every single day. I stared at the tea box on the table, then glanced at the bedside cabinet where the nurse had placed my tray. A mild contraction rolled through my belly, making me bend forward slightly, and through the pain, I reached for one of the tea sachets Jessica had sent, gently pressing it to trap a bit of the residue in my palm. I took a small Ziploc bag the nurse had given me for personal items and discreetly sealed the tea inside. No one noticed. No one knew. But I knew, with crystal clarity, this tea wasn't just to ease labor. And the moment I zipped the bag shut, I felt like I had just sealed the lid on a Pandora's box, ready to blow it open where the truth would have no escape. The very next morning, after the nurse stepped out to handle paperwork, I took the Ziploc bag of tea residue and the umbilical cord blood sample the doctor had preserved after James was born, placed them into a document envelope, and called an independent lab in Boston that I had once partnered with on a biotech project. The technician on the line sounded surprised at the level of detail I wanted for an herbal analysis, but agreed to take the samples the same day. They sent someone to the hospital to collect the envelope, discreetly enough that no one in the department suspected a thing. 3 days later, I received an email response. The analysis report opened on my phone screen while I lay in bed. James still in the NICU incubator. The white background of the PDF stung my eyes, but the very first line was enough to send a freeze through my body. Actaea racemosa, black cohosh, a compound known to cause dangerously strong uterine contractions, and pennyroyal, a substance nearly banned by the FDA for its link to fatal cases of internal bleeding in pregnant women. My heart sank into the pit of my chest. Pennyroyal wasn't something that could accidentally be mixed in. It had to be blended, intentionally, with knowledge, and with purpose. I scrolled down a few more lines and read the lab's warning. Do not use for any pregnant individual. High risk of uterine hyperstimulation, hemorrhage, fetal distress, or death. A piercing chill shot up my spine. All the unusual pain, the nights I curled up on the bathroom floor, the breathless moments that made me feel faint. None of them were just pregnancy fatigue, like Jessica had said. They were symptoms of a calculated medical scheme disguised in the wrapping of herbs good for expecting mothers. I sat upright, my hand clutching the edge of the bedsheet until my knuckles turned white. I had thought Jessica was merely the shameless other woman, but what the lab report revealed was far more sinister. She didn't just want to steal my husband, she wanted to steal my life, and possibly James's too. In that moment, I understood. The tea wasn't a gift, it was a weapon. And Jessica, the one who had brewed it herself, who always smiled sweetly while urging me to keep drinking, was the one who had tried to walk me straight into death's door. That truth hadn't even cooled when later that afternoon, as Detroit was buried under a thicker-than-usual snowfall, 3 loud knocks hit my front door. I opened it to find Jessica on the porch, no longer in her white lab coat, but wrapped in a thick overcoat, her blonde hair wind-tossed. She was shivering, not sure if from cold or fear, but her face tried to appear soft, her eyes red and watery as if she'd been crying. Camila, I'm sorry. I just loved Samuel too much. I got caught up in it. I didn't mean to. I looked her straight in the eye, the cold from the snow still lingering on my wrist. Maybe if this had happened months ago, I would have been weak enough to believe her. But now, after everything I'd seen, after the evidence staring back at me from that lab report, I had no patience left for cheap pleas. I stepped half a pace back, my voice calm but sharp enough to make her flinch. You wanted me dead. Not once. For 3 months. And you knew it. Jessica's eyes widened, her face drained of color. I raised my phone, opened the exact lab report, and held it up to her face. I have proof now. Jessica recoiled as if burned, slipping slightly on the icy porch. She burst into frantic sobs, her voice cracking. No, you misunderstood. I didn't mean, I just wanted Samuel. But I was already dialing hospital security at Cassian, my voice steady. So steady it startled even me. I need to report a senior staff member for unauthorized contact with a patient. Jessica panicked, glancing around, and in a moment of pure fear, she turned and bolted from the walkway, her shoes sliding across the fresh snow, fleeing like someone who finally felt the noose of truth tightening around her neck. The apartment door shut behind me, and I leaned against it to steady my breath. An older nurse, the one who had been caring for James Daly, stood at the end of the hallway, having likely witnessed the end of the confrontation. She placed a hand gently on my arm, her eyes sorrowful but firm. "We believe you." Those 4 words were warmer than any blanket in a Detroit winter. And I knew, from this moment on, I wouldn't be fighting alone anymore. And so, the very next morning, with Detroit still blanketed in the thick snow from the previous night's storm, I took the full lab report, printed page by page, with the most critical sections marked in red highlighter, and stepped into the elevator to the 20th floor of Cassian Medical Center. It was a floor few dared to access, home to the office of Christopher Anderson, the man who had built this hospital empire with his own hands and his reputation. The door opened after 3 knocks, and when he saw me, the sternness on his face softened for a brief second. "Are you all right?" I said nothing, only placed the folder on his wooden desk, letting the truth speak for itself. Christopher opened to the first page. Within seconds, his brow furrowed. By page 2, his hand clenched the edge of the paper. But it was page 3, where the conclusion read, "Pennyroyal, strictly prohibited for pregnant women, risk of internal hemorrhage and death," that made him suddenly drop the coffee mug in his hand. It hit the marble floor and shattered into sharp fragments, the cold crash echoing through the quiet office like a gunshot, startling me. Christopher didn't stoop to pick it up. He just stared at that line, the eyes of a man seasoned by 40 years in medicine, now showing a flicker of horror few had ever witnessed. His voice sank, not the commanding tone of a powerful hospital chairman, but the voice of a father realizing his son had committed a crime far beyond betrayal. "If this gets out, Cassian Medical will collapse. The entire OB/GYN department will be investigated. Over 1,200 employees will lose their jobs. 3 generations of the Anderson name will be buried." He spoke while his hand still trembled slightly, as if unable to believe what he was reading. I took a deep breath, the pressure I'd been carrying in my chest weighing heavy on each word. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice unwavering. All I wanted was a divorce. I paused, fingers lightly clutching the hem of my hospital gown. But now, I'm not sure Samuel and Jessica will let me live long enough to reach the court. That sentence made Christopher look up, his eyes suddenly filled with a mix of rage, fear, and resolve. In that moment, I didn't just see my father-in-law, I saw a man who understood, more clearly than anyone, that this had gone far beyond a broken marriage. This was about survival. Mine, James's, and the entire Anderson family. That's why, just 1 day later, Christopher called me into a small conference room near the hospital's security wing, where he introduced a man in his early 40s, lean and sharp-eyed like a scalpel, Private Investigator Marcus Hale, known for handling some of Michigan's most high-profile medical scandals. He laid a thick folder in front of me and opened it without preamble. "I think you need to know the truth. All of it." The first page was a timeline. I hadn't even reached the second line before my chest tightened. Samuel and Jessica had been having an affair for 2 years. 2 years, meaning back when I still believed our marriage was just struggling because of work. Marcus flipped to the next page and spoke with a voice so even it felt like a verdict. "Their relationship began the night you had the car accident and lost the baby." I looked up, but Marcus continued. "Samuel had been drinking after his shift. Jessica drove him home. They slept together that same night." It felt like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water into my face. The night I lost my first child was the night Samuel gave himself to another woman. Not because he was weak, not because she seduced him, but because while I lay in the ER, unable to speak from the pain, my husband was somewhere else, in someone else's arms. Marcus paused briefly, then spoke again, heavier this time. James's pregnancy was unplanned. Samuel had planned to divorce you to be with Jessica, but when he found out you were pregnant, he postponed. He feared what it would do to his image as a respected OB-GYN, the model son of the Anderson family. I leaned back slowly in my chair, trying to hold my breath together. So the entire 3 months of my pregnancy had been a stage play, performed to protect Samuel's reputation, not out of love, not even responsibility. Marcus slid the final page of the file toward me, bearing a red stamp and the word official. Jessica's family-owned herbal tea company is under federal investigation. Multiple products found to contain banned substances, including pennyroyal. I stared at that page for a long time, so long that the letters seemed to blur. Every piece began falling into place. My abnormal fatigue, the relentless cramps, Jessica's gentle nudges to drink her tea every night, and that look of satisfaction she wore when I scheduled yet another urgent checkup. Nothing had been random. Not a single gesture had been innocent. And when I finally lifted my head, Marcus gave me a slight nod with that steady gaze, as if to say, "Now you've seen the full picture." But before Marcus could gather the files, Christopher had already risen to his feet, his face shifting from barely restrained anger to a cold decisiveness I had never seen in him before. He didn't wait another minute. No family meeting, no private attorney, no explanations from Samuel. He grabbed the entire stack of documents, the lab results, the 2-year affair timeline, the federal investigation report on Jessica's family's tea company, and said just one sentence: "I will handle this." Then he walked out of the conference room, leaving behind the scent of cooling coffee and the heavy silence of everyone still seated. Just 2 hours later, Christopher appeared at the Detroit branch of the Federal Investigation Bureau, personally handing over every piece of evidence to federal agents. The investigators didn't look at him as a father accusing his own son. They saw the hospital director safeguarding the lives of thousands. "I do not cover up crimes," he said, his voice calm but firm, "even if the criminal bears the Anderson name." One sentence was enough to silence the entire room. When Christopher returned to the hospital, the first action happened so fast no one had time to react. Samuel was sitting in his office, hands trembling from pressure, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He was drafting an internal apology email when 3 federal agents walked in. "Dr. Samuel Anderson? We have a warrant for your arrest." In front of young doctors, in front of those who once admired him, 2 cold handcuffs were locked onto Samuel's wrists. He stood frozen, unable to utter a word, his face collapsing, not from guilt, but from the realization that everything he had built had crumbled in the very place he once called home turf. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of Detroit, at the Vance Family Tea Company's mixing facility, Jessica was packing her bag, preparing to flee to Ohio along the route she had planned. But before she could reach the back door, 4 federal agents burst in. "Jessica Vance, you are under arrest for the attempted poisoning of a pregnant woman." She collapsed on the tile floor, the herb measuring spoon slipping from her hand and rolling to the feet of an agent, like one final piece of evidence condemning her. News spread like wildfire. Within hours, every medical network, OB-GYN forum, and doctor community across Michigan was in an uproar. Images of Samuel in handcuffs were shared thousands of times. The hashtag #, Cassian medical scandal trended at the top. Hallway whispers turned into fierce debates, and Jessica's name became synonymous with the betrayal of medicine. I read it all in silence. James still in the NICU incubator, and for the first time in a long while, I no longer felt like the powerless one in this story. Justice had begun to move, and this time it was moving on my side. But just 1 day later, when Samuel was temporarily allowed to meet his attorney before the preliminary hearing, he submitted a request to speak with me, not at the hospital, not in jail, but in a closed conference room under legal supervision from both sides. I stepped in, and Samuel was already seated, hands cuffed at his waist, eyes sunken like he had lived through 10 years instead of 12 hours. As the door closed, he immediately broke down in tears, voice choking into a distorted plea. "Camilla, please, drop the civil suit. I didn't mean for this. I never thought it would go this far. I'm begging you." I looked at the man who was once my husband, once the pride of the Anderson family, now slumped like a child caught in wrongdoing. But my heart no longer trembled. No more regrets, no more blind love. I sat down, placed the divorce papers on the table, and slid them toward him. "I'll drop the civil suit," I said, my voice low but firm, "but only if you sign this." Samuel looked up, eyes filled with both hope and fear. I continued, each word clear as a judge's gavel. "Immediate divorce. You relinquish all parental rights to James, and you forfeit everything. The house, hospital shares, retirement fund, all of it." Samuel opened his mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come out. He looked down at his cuffed hands, then at the divorce papers, weighing the last shred of dignity against the abyss he had dug for himself. Finally, Samuel picked up the pen. His hands shook so badly that his signature strayed from the line, but he signed. 1 stroke. 2. On the last, he let the pen fall, his shoulders collapsing as if all strength had drained from his body. He didn't look at me, didn't look at anyone. And in a strange moment, I realized, this wasn't my victory. This was his reckoning. For the first time, Samuel faced a choice he couldn't manipulate, couldn't fix, couldn't hide from, losing his family, his son, his fortune, and losing me. 3 weeks after Samuel signed the divorce papers, the preliminary hearing took place in Courtroom 6 of the Detroit Federal Courthouse. I held James, now out of the incubator, but still attached to a small monitor, sitting in the front row. Christopher stood beside me, hands clasped, his eyes heavy yet resolute, as if still struggling to accept that his son was entering the courtroom flanked by 2 federal agents. Samuel appeared in the light blue jumpsuit of federal custody, thinner, his gaze hollow. As the judge read out the charges, I saw Samuel's cuffed hands tremble, as if every word was hammering into his chest. The sentencing was swift, decisive, offering no escape for hope. "Dr. Samuel Anderson, the court sentences you to 3 years in federal prison for involuntary manslaughter and concealing hazardous conduct that endangered the life of a pregnant woman." Samuel raised his face for a moment, only to drop his head as the entire courtroom fell silent. No objections, no pleas for leniency, no sobs. Just the heavy silence of a medical community witnessing one of their own fall by his own hand. Jessica's trial followed immediately. She was escorted in, her once glossy blonde hair now disheveled, her face gaunt. But the judge showed no hesitation. "Jessica Vance, this court sentences you to 10 years in prison for the intentional poisoning of a pregnant woman, resulting in life-threatening danger to both mother and child." Jessica broke down, calling out Samuel's name, but he did not turn back. Not once. Then came the judgment on the Vance Family Tea Company. The verdict struck like a hammer, crushing an herbal empire, indefinite shutdown, full production halt, and a criminal investigation into Jessica's father for distributing banned substances. The image of him clutching his head in the courtroom corner told me this truth didn't just destroy 2 individuals. It had brought down a family that once thought itself above it all. Finally, the court clerk read the civil judgment regarding me and James, and when they said, "Camilla Caldwell is granted full custody of James Anderson Caldwell and sole ownership of all marital assets," I felt my legs grow light, as if the weight of the past months had finally lifted. James stirred in my arms, his tiny eyes closed in peace, so serene it clashed with the storm unfolding around us. I pulled him to my chest, took a deep breath, and for the first time since that stormy night, I felt alive. Not just surviving. 3 months after the trial, as the first snow of the season settled over Detroit, I packed my boxes, secured James in his car seat, and drove east, to Boston, the place I once dreamed of restarting my life from zero. I rented a small apartment overlooking the Charles River, opening the windows every morning to let the light in, reminding myself that the darkness had been left behind. And exactly 2 months later, I opened a small counseling office called Renew, where I spent my days listening to women just like me, those who had been betrayed, deceived, broken to the point they didn't think they could stand again. Every evening as I locked up, I told myself, I made it, and they will too. James grew faster than I ever imagined. When he turned 2, we spent the entire autumn in Boston Public Garden. That afternoon, the path was blanketed in fiery red maple leaves, a crisp breeze blowing strands of hair across my forehead. James toddled ahead, his tiny shoes crunching through the leaves with cheerful sounds. I stood there watching him, my heart settling in a way I never thought it could after all the wounds. A hoarse but warm voice called out from behind, "James!" I turned and saw Christopher, now retired early, his face older, but his eyes gentler than ever. He knelt beside his grandson, his hands slightly trembling, yet steady as he tied James's shoelaces. He looked at the child and whispered, his voice soft like a late confession, "You are the best thing this family has ever had." James giggled and threw his arms around his neck, and I stood beside them, stilled by the overwhelming peace of that moment, a moment I once thought I'd never live to see. I stepped forward, placed a hand on Christopher's shoulder, feeling the warmth of 2 generations trying to make things right. I looked up at the Boston sky, turning golden orange in the sunset, then smiled, softly as the wind. After the storm, the sky is always clearer. And this time, I didn't say it to reassure myself. I said it because it was finally true. Thank you for staying with me through to the very end of this story. If Camilla's journey touched your heart, if you believe every woman deserves truth, peace, and a clearer sky after the storm, please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who might need it. You never know. Sometimes just one story is enough to help someone find themselves.